chaises, nous allons commencer la session suivante. I don't know it in Mozambique, guys, sorry, in Portuguese. Obrigada, everyone, obrigada. All right, so for our last session, plenary session, before we, go into the closing ceremony, we have the plenary session 10, which will focus on policy in action, leveraging regional policies and strategies to drive national development outcomes. So let us welcome Dr. Tobias Takavarasha, who is going to facilitate this session. A round of applause, Dr. Tobias Takavarasha.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Canto. All protocols observed. I would like to start by expressing a word of gratitude to the organizers, particularly for the convening strength and the capacity of FANAPAN that has made it possible to blend so many people. There was one session which was talking of children, grandchildren, and grandpas. I would like to classify myself as one of the grandpas. But it is also incredible to say that we are approaching the closing session. Number 10 is the last session, and that we still have so many people around. Can we give an applause for ourselves? I would also want in this vein to thank ADESA and other partners, NMSC, who have facilitated the availability of many different participants. As indicated, the session, I would like to call it high-powered, because it has high-powered commissioners. It is going to be a session, as indicated. We spoke several times about turning policy into action, leveraging regional dialogue to drive national development outcomes. We are all aware that the African Union, since its inception, and prior to that is the Organization of African Unity, its intention was to move towards regional integration and policy harmonization in Africa, with the belief that Africa is stronger as a continent than as individual member states. To that extent, they created the African Union Commission with all its structures, together, of course, with regional economic communities and other international and regional bodies to drive that process. The question we hope to address this morning is that with all those strong regional frameworks and strategic plans, how are member states benefiting? Are they able to translate and align their national development programs with the aspirations that are contained in the national aspirations? And I dare, after this previous session, number 9, to also add global frameworks like the G20 and Sustainable Development Goals. But closer to home in Africa, we have recently the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also we do have CADAP and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and several other plans at regional economic level. So to assist us unpack this discussion, I would like to call upon 3 distinguished panelists, one of whom will give a short keynote presentation. I'll start by calling upon Professor Sipamanka Zondi. Prof. Zondi is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg, UJ. Prof. Zondi was the executive director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD, from 2008 to 2019. And he is serving his second 5-year term with the South Africa National Planning Communication. Welcome, Prof. Second to that, I will call upon Dr. Andrew Jamali. Dr. Andrew Jamali is a social economic development expert with 22 years of experience in policy design, research, capacity building, and foresight planning across public and NGO sectors. He holds a PhD in social statistics and demography, focused on climate change, food security, and nutrition health. A master's in population studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a bachelor's from the University of Malawi. His expertise spans population research, M&E, project arrangement, management, policy impact analysis, and strategic communication. Dr. Jamali led the development of Malawi's first national research agenda and champions foresight research and planning in national development processes. He currently serves as a focal point on food systems transformation, policy evaluation, STI, and institutional capacity building for Malawi's development institutions. Welcome. Last but not least, I deliberately put him last because I know him very well. I would like to call upon our distinguished Emeritus Professor Richard Mkandawire, if he could also come to the podium. Prof. Richard Mkandawire is a socio-economist and a rural development expert, currently serving as Africa Director of the Alliance for Africa Partnerships, AAP, and the chairperson of the Malawi Planning Commission. He was Vice President of AFAP and formerly Senior Advisor at NEPAD, where he led the design and rollout of CADAP. He has held academic roles at Luna, I think that is Longo University, where he helped establish CAD, and at the University of Venda, founding the Center for Youth Studies. He also served as the Africa Regional Director for Youth Programs at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Professor Mkandawire is widely published and has received multiple honors, including an honorary doctorate from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Drivers of Change Award, and appointment as extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria. Welcome, Prof. I also feel honored to stand in front of this distinguished man. At one point in time, I worked under Prof. Mkandawire. He is actually considered the founding member of CADAP, founding documents that led to the development of CADAP prior to the Maputo Declaration in 2003. He drove the process, and then working at NEPAD, I think he traveled across all of Africa, marketing and introducing CADAP. Until now, he's still available to give us his insights and wisdom. As indicated, many of you might wonder why I know so many people here. I'm so delighted to be meeting with so many. It is simply because at one point, I worked in the Department of Agriculture, Ministry of Agriculture, as Permanent Secretary in Zimbabwe, where my colleague Dumisani is sitting, and others who are there. I also worked in Malawi at National Food Reserve Agency. That's why I can say Timrandirane. I can also say in my Abari, I worked in Kenya at Agra for some time, and then at FAO. But my longest stint was here in South Africa, where I worked as FAO representative. That's why I met Cecile, according to Bonani. and many others. So I feel so much at home. 2 stints at Fanapan as former CEO, so I feel to be back home. But be that as it may, let's not be detracted from the core business of this session, which is to unpack how national planning commissions are being able or capacitated to align national development plans with what is coming out of the various frameworks that we have indicated. We also want to examine what is their role in doing that process. How do they integrate, if at all, what is indicated by heads of states in those continental frameworks? Also, we want to share practical examples of how they are doing it in their respective commissions in terms of translating these frameworks into action. We also need to identify what gaps and opportunities to better coordinate. That is, a lot of coordination is needed between the regional bodies and the national planning institutions, as well as to come out of this session with the recommendations on how to improve this effectiveness and the coherence of policy implementation at the national level. So without wasting too much time, I would like to call upon our keynote presenter, Professor Mkandawire, to kickstart the discussion. Thereafter, I will be having specific questions for our 2 panelists together with him. So over to you, Prof, so that we make the best use of the time that has been allocated to us. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation or just Munga Munarangura?
Well, thank you very much, my brother, Dr. Takavarasha. We come a long way together. We've been in the trenches around transforming agriculture food systems across the continent for many, many years. But right at the outset, I would like to congratulate FANAPAN for bringing a range of these thought leaders who are gathered here. We're delighted to see FANAPAN growing and reaching out beyond Southern Africa, and at the same time bringing in new faces, including planning entities which are very central to the agendas which we are actually discussing now around transforming food systems in Africa. I would like also to acknowledge that we have with us the African Union Commission representative. We're delighted to welcome you, and also representatives from AUDA. And CADESA is also here through the CEO. Would like to acknowledge your presence because we believe that some of the conversations here are very much part of the work you're undertaking as CADESA in leading implementation, particularly around transforming our agricultural food systems at the regional level. What I want to share with you are my personal reflections based on my work across the continent in driving both the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, CADAP, but also in my recent capacities in working with the Malawi government as chairman of the National Planning Commission, but also working with other institutions such as Michigan State University, but working with a range of universities across the continent. I would like my entry point, to focus on CADAP, because CADAP is seen as the mother of all frameworks. And we need to keep on referring to that because, in my view, I think CADAP has been reasonably successful in being owned and being seen as an African-driven agenda. And I would like to reflect very briefly in the almost close to the 3 decades of CADAP, or 2 decades, and now we're getting into the 3rd decade of CADAP. Where was it successful, and what lessons can we draw? What lessons can we draw from CADAP? In the first decade of CADAP, I think one big lesson is that, you know, it was actually an African, seen as an African framework, continental framework, owned by, you know, members of the heads of state and government across the continent. And there was genuine commitment to driving this continental framework, which was expected to inform the work of the regional economic communities around agriculture transformation and food security, but also member states. What led towards it being owned as an African-driven agenda? First of all, it was actually the leaders' commitment. You may recall that, you know, we moved into a process of ensuring initially to make sure that our ministers owned it, and I'm glad, again, looking at CADESA, they are following almost the same, you know, CADAP sort of footprints to make sure that ministers at the regional level begin to appreciate why, you know, this needs to be embraced by them as, you know, ministers of agriculture. We went to West Africa, we went to East Africa, IGAD, we went to COMESA, we went to SADC, and the ministers actually spoke about this question of ownership. And let's not forget, for colleagues, I mean, who were actually around there, including Professor Dr. Takabarasha, there were a lot of contestations. Not everybody was on board, you know. So we needed to bring on board ministers, our own ministers, to really, you know, make them own it and, you know, embrace it as their own. You know, I don't want to go into the details of how some of even the global partners were actually against CADAP, including some of the African institutions that were against CADAP, because they felt, you know, what is this? I mean, you know, we are already used to our own, you know, internal frameworks, our own agendas. What is this? It's going to be disruptive. But you know, through mobilization of these ministers to own it, you know, it really provided, I think, a new direction, a momentum for CADAP. And this led towards member countries, based on the roadmap we had defined, to begin to sign compacts. We started with Rwanda in 2007, and then followed by countries like Burundi, Cape Verde, Sierra Leone, and many, many others, leading towards the signing by virtually all African countries endorsing the CADAP process. What was even more exciting was that it was even the head of state themselves and government that were also part of the signing of the compact. We went to Burundi, for example, where, you know, the then president of Burundi mobilized 20 cabinet ministers that were on the table during the signing ceremony, you know, endorsing that. We went to Sierra Leone. There were 7 ministers who were actually witnesses to the signing of the CADAP compact. And in that meeting, when we actually made our presentations, you know, on the commitments that, you know, came out of Maputo, he asked his finance minister, say, how much are we contributing towards agriculture budget? The minister said, no, 7%. He said, no. 7%? I thought we agreed in Maputo that it should be 10%. Can I see 10% go to agriculture right away? You know, right there was commitment of, you know, additional funding to the agriculture sector. I know there are contestations, questions whether, you know, what does 10% mean, but I think evidence would show that, you know, there's been increased flow of financing to the agriculture sector as a result of that continental commitment by the African leaders. So what is the big lesson here? The big lesson is that, one, we need, I think, commitment of our leaders, but more importantly, we need the building of our coalitions. That building of coalitions was absolutely fundamental. But an important lesson, though, which we're beginning to learn, and again, we're engaging our colleagues, I was talking to the CEO, is about how do we really deepen this question of localization. Because it's very easy to come up with these continental frameworks, to come up with our own, you know, outcomes of the summit in Nairobi on soil health and fertilizer. And it's very easy for global institutions to want to run with it because they see money. They see opportunities for building their own institutions. I don't want to talk about those institutions which elsewhere are driving the fertilizer agenda and soil health agenda, which came out of the summit. And again, I would like to congratulate SADC, where SADC representative is here. for really leading and saying, in the case of SADC, it will be CADESA driving this process. It will not be the CG centers. They're important, yes, but it's got to be an African institution, and that is CADESA. And CADESA is driving that, that process. Extremely critical. And I think this is going to emerge as a unique model, particularly on the fertilizer and soil health implementation action plan. So what is the big lesson we're learning again? It's about also localization. And again, I want to be very intentional. Again, this is where my colleagues from the planning commissions maybe will speak to that. When we're saying localization, have we defined a methodology of that localization? Again, CEO for FANAPAN, what is this localization? How do we deepen that ownership at the country level? How can we deepen that localization, to make sure that, there's truly internalization of the framework, there's ownership at the local level? Is it about, one single institution at the country level being the entry point in that localization? Yes, it is important that we identify strong institutions at the country level that will drive that localization agenda and bring on board other stakeholders. But what is it all about? Again, we go back to the question of coalition. You need to build a strong coalition at the country level. CEO, CADESA, how do we build those strong institutions? But strong institutions that have got strengths in different areas, because at the end of the day, you want, like-minded, a coalition of willing partners who are like-minded to come together to drive that agenda. In my experience, there's nothing as powerful as a coalition of stakeholders exerting pressure on governments, a coalition of stakeholders exerting pressure on the international community. Local voices driving that agenda. That should be our focus. So this methodology, again, going back to FANAPAN as well, and going back to CADAP, these CADAP focal points, are they really going to drive transformation at the country level? No, it's coalitions of stakeholders that will drive that transformation at the country level. Let the focal points be coordinators. In the case of soil health, we have identified, of course, Mwapata Policy Institute to coordinate, but it's bring on board a coalition of stakeholders that will drive change and transformation and ownership by these local institutions. Are we shying away from global partners? No. But we want them to come on board under the terms of these coalitions, which are local coalitions. For me, that is localization. But more importantly, I think it's about identifying, institutions also which have the gravitas at the local level, have the ability to call upon the Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Trade, and say, by the way, this is what our leaders have agreed upon. This is what we have agreed upon, even as a nation, or stakeholders have agreed upon. So which are these institutions that have the gravitas to get on board, the leadership? And these planning entities at the national level are extremely important. And I would like to urge colleagues here from different countries to really bring on board, the voice of these national planning entities, national planning commissions. In the case of Malawi, in terms of the Fertilizer and Soil Health Action Plan, the National Planning Commission co-chairs the steering committee as a co-chair, plus the Minister of Agriculture. Because within the context of the National Planning Commission, the National Planning Commission has been mandated through an act of parliament to convene ministries. So it can actually call upon ministries, to really, respond to the priorities and to facilitate that ownership. So I think that's one of the big lessons which I wanted to put on the table. And I'm sure my colleagues here will speak to that. The related issue, again, learning from CADAP, is particularly, in the second decade, was around accountability. Who really is responsible for accountability? Do we really follow up, set up, have we defined accountability mechanisms within our own processes, within the context of, again, soil health and action plan? How are countries going to be accountable to make sure that they deliver on the priorities that have been defined by CADESA? Again, national planning commissions elsewhere, including Malawi, for example, are actually mandated to hold governments, ministries accountable to define national plans, in this case, including the question of fertilizer. But the most, I think, thorny issue, which, again, I want to put on the table, and we've had discussions with our colleagues in CADESA, is around financing. Who is going to finance the planning? Again, national planning commissions is a big question. What role can national planning entities play in financing? I've been to scores of summits at the continental level within the context of CADAP. In 2006, we had a summit on fertilizer and soil health. No, we had a summit just on fertilizer. We went to Abuja. Obasanjo convened that summit, President Obasanjo, and members of countries committed to setting up a financing mechanism for fertilizer, the African Fertilizer Financing Mechanism. I don't know whether my colleagues from FAP are here. They're not here, But how many countries committed to funding that? In the first 10 years, we only had two: Nigeria and Tanzania. Then FAP made us a contribution of about $1 million to that fund, and then Ghana came on board later on. But no other country came on board to put money on the table. I think this speaks volumes. Our leaders, I think, are acculturated into believing that it's the global north that is going to fund our development. That would never happen. When we began doing some calculations with Dr. Tobias around the money required to drive transformation of the CADA process, we're talking of billions. Even just the fertilizer agenda, to truly transform, to restore our soils in the continent, we don't need $200 million. The donors we met in Nairobi, they committed some resources, I think 200 million or so, plus others, and our leaders were clapping. I said, for God's sake, you're clapping for 200 million? That's a small drop in the ocean of needs in restoring our soils. Just soil health alone needs billions of dollars. But do we have money? Can we mobilize money internally? I think that's a big question. And I think, again, African Union, some of us will continue to challenge our leadership and say, we need a Marshall Plan for Africa in transforming our food systems. We need billions of dollars to transform our food systems. Not 200 million from some donor, not 10 million from some NGO. Again, my friend Shunga, Ishmael, was saying, it seems, some of these interventions just perpetuate poverty. It seems, poverty is a growing industry in Africa, where they give us 10 million there, 20 million there, they cushion poverty, and we continue to be caught up in this vicious circle of poverty. We need massive injection of funding into the agriculture sector in transforming our food systems. And again, have national planning entities got a role to play? And again, I'm sure colleagues will speak to that on how we can really, as national entities, finance our various range of priorities. One of the issues we're focusing on, in the case of Malawi, is to drive this, what we're calling developmental state ethos. I'm sure some of you have read Tandika Mkandawiri's works around driving a developmental state where national entities are beginning to take leadership in defining the participation of our own private sector, entities to drive transformation, whether it's in the agriculture sector, whether it's mining, they participate in that. Sadly, we allow global, entities to drive that transformation. They take leadership in mining, in tourism, in agriculture, leaving out, local, businesses. So this developmental ethos, which are, we are pushing in the case of Malawi, and maybe other countries, including South Africa, how can we, put resources, particularly in the agriculture sector. Going forward, one of the issues which, again, I've raised with the CEO, and he was also reminding me in terms of how we should, really focus on this question of scaling up and scaling deep, as well as outscaling of the pockets of successes that are out there. We have successful interventions in South Africa. We have successful interventions in Lesotho, Swaziland, Malawi. How do we scale those up? Very often, I think we assume that it's all doom and gloom, and that there's nothing going. We continue to get angry with our governments. But there are pockets of successes that are, need to be scaled up. They need more resources. Do we focus on those? Speaking to colleagues from SADC, including the secretary, executive secretary, he says our leaders are tired of these protracted processes, conversations, research. They want to see something happening. And the quickest way of ensuring that something is happening is to capitalize on successes that are on the ground. It doesn't matter whether they're run by Catholic Relief Services or they're run by some other NGO. Can we own them? I mean, if it's a good idea that is going to be impactful on the ground, let's actually grab it as CADESA, as FANAPAN, and say, well, you are actually working in Malawi, you're working in Zambia. We believe this is actually going to drive our objectives. We're going to run with it as FANAPAN, as CADESA. Can we actually put more resources? Would like Lesotho to learn from this. Would like Mozambique to learn from this. How do we really move towards scaling up and also scaling deep, as I was reminded by Professor Yamini? How do you do that? I think that should be an important area of focus going forward. Having said that, I think one of the conversations that seem to be emerging, again, national entities could facilitate this, is about how we begin to redefine a new global architecture in our partnerships with the rest of the globe, particularly in the way we have seen what is happening at the global stage with the continued withdrawal and the drying port of donor funding, again, which has always been a drop. Can we begin to look to the South for knowledge, particularly in the R&D system? Can we look into new partnerships from the global South? Vietnam, China. Again, I put that to the table of SADC and perhaps CADESA to explore that opportunity. Again, I was hearing from our deputy chair of CADESA that Zimbabwe is already very deep into conversations around land restoration and water, soil health, through partnership with China. And Madagascar, Malagasy, they're also doing the same. And so are, I think, a few other countries. So again, there are these pockets of, partnerships with the rest of the South, but nobody is actually coordinating those partnerships. Can CADESA or FANAPAN come in to really look at, these partnerships with the rest of the South and find a way of coordinating those, partnerships? I know these national entities are also in conversations with the Global South. I think we need to begin to redefine that engagement with the rest of the South. And again, I see national entities being part of, national planning entities being part of that. In conclusion, I just want to say, you know, it cannot be overemphasized that we need to convince our leaders that they have a responsibility to put resources on the table. Without funding, we're wasting our time. And it's got to be domestic funding. And the resources are there. If we look at the wastage of resources in our own countries, it's huge. You know, let's convince them. So building allies at the national level is important. Identifying who are these allies at the national level. Members of the Agriculture Committee, a few ministers. Let's convince them that this is for the interest of all our nations, but also is for the interest of the rest of the region. But the bottom line, we need to own the agenda. We need to take ownership. And the ownership lies in FANAPAN, the ownership lies in CADESA, the ownership lies in the institutions which are gathered here. How can we own this agenda and bring in these radical ideas, radical interventions, disruptive thinking, and committing, at the end of the day, funding to those radical ideas and radical interventions. I thank you.
Wow. Another round of applause for the prof as he sits down. Yes, this is very powerful. I can summarize it. I know he has elaborated on his experience in CADAP, that it could be used as one tool, as an example of how a continental framework is being cascaded to national implementation. He also highlighted the importance of strong national coalitions and institutions that can approach and push and remind their governments to implement what they have agreed as aspirations at continental level. He has also highlighted the issue of ownership and accountability and funding to ensure that these goals are realized. One of our biggest challenges this morning was to try and condense Professor Zondi's CV into 3 or 4 lines. Now it's going to be an even bigger challenge to ask him to speak for 5 minutes, knowing his length of experience, passion, and knowledge as chairman of the South African National Planning Commission. But in your address as a panelist, try also to elaborate to us what role is the planning agents taking in terms of incorporating those continental global aspirations into what South Africa wants to achieve at national level, and how can the experience of South Africa be shared with the rest of the continent where national planning commissions exist. In those countries that they don't have national planning commissions, they still have systems vested in Office of President or Ministry of National Planning, which do the same part as what the national planning commissions are doing. So over to you, Prof. Well.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Much appreciated. And good morning to all of you. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Mkandawiri, for setting it out so well for us so that we may understand critical issues related to the coordination of development planning across various levels. I would just pick up a couple of things, maybe for purposes of taking the discussion further and not repeat what you have said, and just pick up things going forward. Of course, I speak here coordinating international partnerships and international dimensions of development planning in the South African National Development Planning Commission. Seized with the idea about how do you influence the international environment to achieve your national goals. How do you harness all manner of opportunities and threats and possibilities in the international environment outside your national borders, which is regional, continental, and beyond continental. All are considered international. How do you take advantage of those in order to reduce poverty, in order to increase employment, in order to improve the quality of life of people? Because if any national development does not reduce poverty, then it is missing its purpose. If it doesn't grow employment, then it's also not achieving its purpose. If it doesn't lead to the improvement in the quality of lives of people, then it doesn't achieve its purpose. What we agonize about, Prof, is the fact that we have beautiful plans. South Africa has a beautiful plan, and Africa has beautiful plans. But the outcomes are not beautiful. People continue to live in poverty, inequality continues to grow, and all of those kinds of things. And I'm reminded of the responses to a speech by Mwalimu Nyerere in Parliament where somebody said, you know, we have a beautiful experience of achieving independence, beautiful experience of achieving what is supposed to be freedom. But the outcomes of it are horrible. People live in serious poverty. People live in sickness and disease. Things are falling apart right before us. What has gone wrong? What has happened? Now we are agonizing about how do we get to move from beautiful plans to beautiful conditions, to beautiful outcomes. How do we overcome that trap, which is an implementation trap? Why is it that we are unable to implement the beautiful ideas that we have? Why is it that we are unable to make that jump? It's very clear. It doesn't have to be an outcome of research. It's very clear because it's been written about going back to the 1960s, that part of it is that the plans are not within us, the plans are without us. The plans are outside of us. The plans are out in the boards, the plans are out in documents, the plans are with the experts, the plans are not in society, they're outside society. Partly because the African state has for a long time been outside people's lives. Just how it is. The state is a government out there. I am not government. And partly because then the national plans are then government plans, they are also outside like government is. Because we have not got to a point of completely owning our government, completely owning our sovereignty, completely owning our systems. Now, if you look at Agenda 2063, the second implementation plan, it really points to us a number of things that we should think about. The first thing is that if we miss anything about the Agenda 2063, we should not miss the first aspiration, because it's not first by accident, but it is first because it is the most important one. It says it towards an inclusive growth and sustainable development. So it is saying to us what we're trying to achieve is to grow this continent, grow each village in it, grow its suburb in it, grow its province, its state, each country, grow it, but also ensure that there is sustained, improved levels of life or quality of life for people. Because anything else you achieve is of no purpose. If we achieve the rail, the continental rail, it will be a beautiful thing to brag about, but nothing really to celebrate. If we achieve the common air transport system, we would have really achieved something that might come out as a nice token, but not really changing people's life. If we achieve any of those flagships, but we don't achieve inclusive growth and sustainable development, we would not get far. Then it says to us, the reason why we had not achieved it in the first 10 years of Agenda 2063 are as follows. The first one relates to legal and governance frameworks. Our legal and governance framework are not aligned with where we are going. We know it. I mean, Mkandawiri wrote about it, Professor Mkandawiri, the late Mkandawiri wrote about it, that we inherited states. We did not create new states. That's a reality. I come as in South Africa, I can say it in front of our own leaders. We did not liberate, so we included everybody in what was already created and gave it a new name. What used to be called Department of Native Affairs became Department of Interior, but it's the same department. With a new name, a nicer name. Maybe gave it a liberation hero name and all that, but you're putting a name over an empire name. So the legal and governance systems are designed for one goal, but we are trying to use them for a different goal. An African proverb says, however long a log of wood stays underwater, it does not become a crocodile. However much you try to make it used for MP, if it's designed from MA, it will keep reproduces MA. That is how it is. So this legal and governance framework are related closely to traditions of power and traditions of doing and traditions of governing. If those don't change, the outcomes for Agenda 2063 effort will not change. So we don't only just need institutional reform in the sense of technical reform, but we need fundamental reform, a complete rethinking of order. The second set of impediments it talks about are economic and structural barriers. That the economies are not designed for what you are trying to make them to do. Rather, extractive economies that were meant to export, taking goods to the sea so that it can get to Europe. They're not designed for what we are doing, and we have not rethought the economies. Now we're reminded of 1963 speech, Weapon of Theory, by Amilcar Cabral, warning liberation movement at the time that they were clearer about the enemy we needed to remove, not much clearer about the vision they wanted to build. And that they get to power, they know the enemy a lot more than they know the friend. They know the enemy more than they know the change we need to do. No theory of change, no vision, no original ideology. Borrow ideology either from the West or from the East. Capitalism or Marxism, both of them are borrowed. An African proverb says, borrowed waters won't quench your thirst. They will fill your stomach, of course, but they won't quench your thirst. They won't address your issues. You get what I'm saying? So there are issues of economic reform that are required so that there is articulation between the national efforts and the regional effort. What's the point of South Africa building a road corridor from Cape Town all the way to Messina, as if goods are going to be offloaded in Messina? The goods are heading for DRC. Why does the corridor end in Messina? It can only be colonial mentality of liberated countries. You plan national for problems that are not national. It's a problem. We must accept it. So when you talk about complementarity across the borders and stuff, if there's no complementarity in the mind, there won't be complementarity in the minds. Is it true? The third set of impediments related to political dynamics and institutional design. It is, as it says, my time is up. Yeah, so the institutional designs are such that you end up with overlapping systems and all of those things, and dislocated people. We have a whole group of people who live in areas that do not belong to either countries. It is borderlands, you call them, border between Botswana and South Africa. Those are people who go drink tea across the border and eat lunch on the other side of the border. But the national planning is assuming one to be on one side and the other one to be on the other side. It's crazy. It is because it's not our making. It is a crisis of Berlin. It was all drawn up in Berlin. What you call South Africa, you have to accept it with a twinge of salt, because it's not our design. We didn't draw this border. We simply accepted it. It leads to fragmentation, it leads to dislocation, it leads to inability to do that. The last set of impediments related to implementation. And here it refers to the mechanisms for implementation that are not designed for implementation. If we come to think about it, the way we do government is to do more planning and more caucusing and more preparing than doing. If we have to do, we outsource it to the NGOs, outsource it to donor agencies, outsource it to service providers. Now you wonder, those who are in state, what are they supposed to provide if those who are outside state are the ones who are the service providers? So the ones in the state are the service designers. So we create a state of designers who spend a lot of time either designing or divining, which is to anticipate, we want to achieve this in 2020. You know, Sangoma in Zulu, we call it Sangoma. It's a person who divines the future, but doesn't actually implement the future. Somebody else must implement the future. So we have to worry then about how do we overcome this through greater harmony among entities that do this. My closing and parting shot is this. It is for this reason that catalysts for change, such as national planning commissions, regional economic communities, all of those that are meant to defy all of this, hearken very closely to Kwame Nkrumah's point, which is repeated in the Agenda 2063 preamble, which is said we must not only undo the colonial borders, we didn't undo them, but we must also undo the colonial borders in our mind. Because it is the mindset that have set us for failure and nobody else. Not imperialism, not enemies, not people from outside, not even the devil and his mother-in-law. None of them have actually set up for failure. It is our mindset that has set us up for failure. So we keep trying to do stuff and it keeps not happening. An African proverb says, they who fail to dance say the dancing floor is thorny. So they don't say it's their decision not to fail. They blame it on the circumstances. We fail to implement because we think the enemy out there or the finance is a problem. We externalize the problem. The biggest challenge we face in Africa is not the finance, it's not the institution, it's the African himself. The sooner we're able to work around this, we don't go technical alone, look at bit of the plan, but work on people's belief in themselves and people's belief in their own plans and people's commitment to work to produce a better world. An African proverb says, take care of this earth not because it was brought down to you by your great-grandparents and your ancestors, but because it was lent to you by your great-grandchildren. We owe it to them to succeed. Thank you.
Wow. This is rich. Thank you very much, Prof. Zondi. It's very important, the number of things that you have highlighted. You have actually contributed significantly to answering the questions that this session is trying to address. Why is it that the continental frameworks are not being fully implemented through national plans and achieving the desired objectives? I think the issues of the legal systems, the ownership and the mismatch between implementation and design, and the mentality that if your shoe is tight, you want to say that my shoe is very small. You don't want to say my feet are very big. But anyway, thank you very much for that. I would like to call upon Andrew Jamali, Dr. Andrew Jamali, our last panelist, to now cascade it all, knowing that the timekeepers are looking at us. It's very difficult to say to you, keep your time when I didn't say it to the others, but I know.
So you can see by the twist of the microphone that there's a lot more work to be done by me here. My learned prof from Malawi explained it 2 days ago that nutrition has played a big role in terms of defining what stature we should have as Africans. And I think I'm a testament to that this morning. Not that I'm blaming anyone, but I'm blaming you guys because we sit in this continent and there is some work to be done about it. I'm just grateful to God that it didn't affect the mindset. So I don't know how you'd feel like being me this time, sandwiched between these powerful men seated up front here. My prof on this side, prof on the left side, and the right-hand side. But I'm really grateful for Fanapan really to sandwich me in this between these two brains. I think the issue about regional policies and how they have to be created and operationalized as levers for national development is something that maybe we have not given so much thought about. Particularly, maybe I would speak about my southern region part of Africa. Why do I say so? I look at ourselves as really rushing to align and rushing to ratify these treaties and big frameworks without a proper assessment of how much it will take for us to get them delivered. And I think that is where we sit and find ourselves to be in today. I say so because if we are to go around the countries within the region and how much we have actually done in terms of traction in meeting the regional strategic goals that we have set to achieve, not many of our countries would really stand tall to attest that we are doing well. Southern Africa, by all analysis, socioeconomic development analysis, is pronounced much more with indicators that are not impressive. Running from food production, poverty itself, nutrition, education and technologies, innovations, and yet we are having loads and loads of frameworks that we have developed to transform our countries and our region. That should speak a lot about how much we conceptualize our planning. And the reason that some governments within the region have thought about setting aside some institutions that would specifically be addressing the question of planning really stands to be given a lot more priority in terms of how we're operationalizing our development agenda. The National Planning Commission in Malawi was actually created by an act of parliament in 2017 to orchestrate the country's long-term vision and oversee how that vision gets realized. And it is from lessons that have been generated over years, the issues of political cycles intervening development outcomes. I guess you understand what I mean by that. You have a new political party that's gone into power, it brings its own agenda, and it tears down all whatever frameworks might have been there, crafted by technicians like you, looking ahead like the Sangomas, like my prof has said. Why? They are chasing a political agenda which is in conflict with the development agenda of the country. And that's where planners have to think through on how they merge the conflict that might exist between political interest versus national development interest. In the context of Malawi, we have superseded that problem because we have really insulated the vision that any incoming government would have to align itself in terms of programming and operationalizing its development manifesto along the national development vision. And then there's the issue of short-terminism in terms of our planning spaces. Much of our planning have been in 5-year cycles. And I'm not so sure if you were a politician, you are given 5 years to discharge a country's mandate. How are you going to manage that? At the same time, you're accountable to your voters and the funders that really sponsored your campaign. You must account to the money that gave you within 5 years. And you and I know how much, expectations would be there in the voters with regards to you to deliver on the country's expected mandates and the country's expected development outcomes. Now, the question comes to say, what is the interface between policy and planning? By policy, I'm talking about a political statement that a politician will stand on the podium to make that is going to transform the country. And then by planning, I'm looking at the realities that should galvanize that into action. That's where we sit with planning entities. Because we must translate the political goals, merge them with the national interest, and make sure that there's visible transformation in our countries. So that requires a lot of thought-provoking questions, a lot of deep thinking, because the element of time and resource constraints governize that particular space. In the context of Malawi, we have aligned our development framework, the Malawi 2063, You might wonder why we are pegging into 2063. Yes, that speaks a lot more to alignment, because African agenda is Africa Agenda 20 what? 63. But of course, we've coined our own reason for that, because by 2063, we'll be 100 years of independence, and we want to assess ourselves after 100 years. Where do we sit? So the first point of alignment for my country has been to align with the Continental Development Agenda. And then there's these other strategic frameworks that we're talking about, the RISDIP. Now we're talking about CADEP within the agriculture space. That is good. But the question is, like Prof mentioned, what have been the frameworks of alignment? If we say that South Africa has aligned its regional development, country development agenda to RISDIP, aligned its country development agenda to Africa Agenda 2063, and CADEP, as we say, what matrix of alignment are we using? Because this speaks to planners. What key tenets, the qualitative aspects of alignment that have been teased out, can we be able to explain about those things? Why is that important? It's important because the operationalization of the continental agenda has to go seamlessly with the national agenda. And that speaks to the point of capacity. When we ratify these international regional development agendas, do we assess our capacities to run this twin programming as countries? And that's the job of national planning entities. That speaks to how much it will take to transform our countries within the realms of the ratifications that we made in the region. So if we are talking about CADEP, CADEP actually recommends that we allocate more than 10% now. It's 12 to 15% somewhere there to the agriculture sector. The question is, what kind of conversation goes between planning entities and parliamentarians who allocate resources? And what kind of packaging of the messages to convince these parliamentarians and politicians that have got a 5-year stint to demonstrate their capacities in terms of the campaigns that they made? That's the space which requires a lot of ingenuity, a lot of thoughts, a lot of research, a lot of connectivity. Again, resolving the issue of political economy hasn't been something that we have actually dealt with as a region. The contestations between policies and politics still remains to be done. Questions are being asked to say, we run into putting plans, but we are so slow into implementation. Why? Because the resources are not in the planner's space. And I have learned over the past 22 years that unless the plan and the resources are in the same space, there's going to be traction. Without that, there's not going to be traction. And the key question is, how do we make the planners and the politicians resonate their thinking towards operationalizing national and regional goals? The issue of financing has come to be very pertinent now as we speak, because there's a global realignment in terms of aid, in terms of even FDIs. Now that we talk about the trade tariffs that you and I have been, ushered into with the new dispensation in America. Africa has always depended, and as my two profs indicated, that our financing for development has always been outward looking, without looking at what else can we actually do from within. And I think that speaks to the question of indigenizing development. When we talk about framing development policies, who are we copying from? Are these policies indigenized enough, so much so that when you look at the proposed transformations, they are actually speaking to the indigenous context, both in terms of shaping the problems themselves and the approaches that have to be used to actually address those kind of problems? Because once we begin to indigenize our context, we will indigenize everything, including our financing mechanisms. As we speak, that's a challenge that we must actually undertake. I'm not so sure whether everyone read the script that the Americans will change their shift in terms of global aid policy. There might have been some feelers about it, but we never knew that it was going to be as it has been now. And so governments have to sit and reflect. And that speaks to how we are interfacing with all agents of development in the context. And I want to speak about the private sector. How many are from the private sector in here? Hands up. Thank you, guys. You can see the hands. Oh, again, lift up the hands. So these guys are making money in our country. And we are not taking time to sit with them when we need the money to service our own development. That's something that we must think hard about. How much engagement with all actors in the development space is taking place in our individual countries? Because in the final analysis, they are thriving on our own people that we want to transform. And as planning entities, that's something to think hard about. I would like to close by stressing the need for knowledge. Africa is known to have a lot of reserves for knowledge. And we are not running short. Of course, they actually argue that we do not have written knowledge. But I think that speaks to a lot of ingenuity that we have, that we can keep a lot of knowledge for years in our brains. But how much of that knowledge is being shared across all actors to make them make informed decisions? For what? Appropriate design of development programming. 2, resource allocation and prioritization of interventions. And 3, holding each other accountable. We see it in forums like this, and national planning entities have the role to facilitate this knowledge outlay into the space. Why? If we do not share insights, if we do not share knowledge, it is going to be difficult for us to arrive at the same page, to advance a common agenda. And that's where the research comes into play. And I've always wondered why our universities are not aggressive enough in terms of intensifying the policy and research interface. And that's the discipline I would like to venture into seriously, to look at what will it take to have a policymaker listen to a research output. Most of our research findings or research outputs are providing what I would call generalized recommendations. Or we have climate change now. There's a lot of soils that have been degraded. The solution is to have climate smart agriculture. And my uncle in a policy space will ask, what is climate smart agriculture? Or government must make sure that it generates a lot of resources. How? So researchers must go deep in their own recommendations and their propositions to explain how this sorry politician, this sorry policymaker has to actually adopt and do whatever is being recommended from research. So when you talk about climate smart agriculture, do we understand the investment that goes into climate smart agriculture? There is innovation that has to go into there. There are technologies which we do not own as Africa that have to go into there. We're talking about irrigation equipment. We're talking about soil testing equipment and the like. They are not manufactured here. And our universities of technologies are waiting to assemble these gadgets that are made up in the East. When shall we begin to reflect on our own technologies and indigenize this to capacitate the knowledge space for policymakers and policy operationalization? As I close, I would like us to reflect on a few things. And that is to say that transformation will not come from anywhere. I know that the food systems transformation agenda is not a Southern African origination. It originated with the UN. And I know conversation about food systems started way back after the financial crisis in 2008, at least for the literature that I've come across. But I think we need to begin to own the agenda itself. And we cannot own this agenda until we realize what exactly we want to transform about ourselves. There are talks about soils, and I think climate change has really advanced the need for us to think about soils. There is talk about cross-border water management. I talked about 2 days ago, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, that we receive our water almost 58% from a river in Tanzania that flows into Lake Malawi and down into our distributary Shire River. When Shire River floods, our energy system is affected, our crop system down the river valley is affected. In fact, when it rains so harsh, our soils, which we apply so much fertilizer, go down into Maputo and Mozambique. The cross-border interface in these areas is quite important. And these regional frameworks are meant to make us think in a cross-border approach in terms of managing our resources. The issue about national planning entities holding accountable those that are acting on development in the space stands quite pertinent. But the question is, what is our framework of accountability that we can generate to guide these guys as they're operating? That's something that we would want to really delve into and facilitate such kind of a conversation that when we hold these kind of meetings next year in the same regional forum, instead of lamenting of things that are not going on right, let us talk about things that should be scaled up. Things that have promised that there is traction and there is transformation and impact in the spaces that we are working with in our region. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you again. I think, as you can all see and agree with me, this session would have required the whole morning. But knowing that, of course, there are many other things that would have come, we want to thank again Dr. Andrew Jamali for adding some more dimensions. I think the issue of the political aspects of our planning is very crucial. I'm sure as the Secretariat is capturing these notes, the recommendations will probably come out of what has been said, that there's a lot to be learned by sharing experiences between the different national planning commissions. For example, the Malawi example of incorporating and aligning their plan to Agenda 2263 is also very crucial. He has also highlighted, of course, that when we do our plans, there are a lot of unknown factors that should be built in. The Sangomas were not able to foresee the tariffs, but now let us ask you to ask questions. I know that CEO is looking at Kando to manage the time, but it will be very unfair for the panelists and for the audience or the dialogue participants not to give a chance to any burning question. You can direct it to any of the speakers or just in general, they will know what to pick. It's an opportunity that we have, knowing their busy schedules, all of them, to have them here for this 1 hour session is very, very valuable. So we'd like to, not to deny you the option to raise your hand. Question, I think you can speak from where you are sitting once the question comes. And right. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. And also Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three experts. My question goes to Professor Kandawire. You have experienced speaking to heads of state, present and former. I'm wondering if there are specific characteristics of heads of state that make them fertile ground to receive messaging and also that advocacy may work. I would presume that the same message, someone in office may receive it and another may not. Is it a characteristic of the recipient, or is it me who is interfacing with the head of state, Prof. Nkandawire? Thanks.
Thank you. Madam Beatrice.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful insights. I think two things. How are national planning commissions really shifting the policymakers, business champions, civil society, and really every one of the citizens to changing their mindsets around what the development that we want, but also given that we are looking for disruptive innovations in how our development agenda is being championed, taking chance with the new energies around the youth, putting women at the center. How are they catalyzing a shift towards a trust-based development with new influences that are coming? And the last one is, are the current development plans curated around the dead ODAs, or there is a new financing architecture that probably the National Planning Commissions are championing, taking into account the worth around our natural resources, and mostly there may be just the insights on how are we integrating natural resources, capital accounting, moving away from the GDPs that we know that it doesn't really calculate Africa's worth.
Thank you. Yes, we'll start right at the back, Francis, and then the other back.
It's Francis here. He's here.
Yes.
I was right in the corner, further than Francis.
Oh,
No,
I
Francis
start
by
with,
name. It's Francis by name.
I
Yeah,
start with
thank
Simba,
you.
then Francis.
Dr. Jamali, thank you for a wonderful presentation, intervention. I would like to believe that the capacity demonstrated by the NPC Malawi resides in all the other countries. Away from the innocence that most of us mere mortals walking, NPCs would be able to carry out this kind of analysis across all, say, the 16 SADC countries. Is there a platform where the NPCs come, share that analysis, align and help SADC achieve its integration agenda? If it is not there, is this not one of the things that should be priority now to make sure that integration is achieved in the region? And taking it beyond SADC, EAC, ECOWAS, and obviously looking at continental integration. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Sibanda.
Yeah, thank you. Just to thank I'm going to target this as at the Planning Commission colleagues that, I don't know, can you hear me? Okay.
my challenge is when I look at all the planning that we do, the frameworks, whether it's continental, but more so at the national level, we have policies that have no resources allocated to them. And then we are surprised that there is no implementation. So my question is, if I look at the example, say, from Europe, even from America, the big, beautiful bill, that is a policy document, but it's well detailed as to who gets what money and how, whereas our policies, or rather our plans, do not actually go that far to define the resources, who is going to get them, and how that implementation will happen. And then we call these documents policies. So that is my challenge. As long as we are not tying the policies to the resources, the Sangomas will sing and will blame them, but will not get anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Those 4 questions.
Thank you.
Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
So, thank you to all the presenters. That was a really insightful session. And I think my question goes to, now that we understand the colonial aspect that is behind how we operate, and even explained within the national planning commissions, like who holds the power? Because we have our SADC, we have our AU, where we would think that where countries have even gone beyond 60 years of independence, there should be a shift. So where is the pain point to moving into the direction where we actually own, indigenize, and whatever name we can give it, so that Africans are driving the agenda? Thank you.
Thank you. 2 more, Christian, and then Florence. I know all the names. I'm not a Sangoma, by the way.
Thank you. Mine is not a question, but a contribution, I think, to one of the reasons our governments or our nations are failing to actualize our plans. I think we are a bit reluctant to what I could say. We want to perpetuate continuity by blaming the shortness of time. This is why, actually, in most cases, we fail or we are slow to realize our outcomes, to use it as a reason to justify our continuation in power or in our positions. So in most cases, I think I could attribute it to one of the things which was mentioned about our accountability. I think there isn't so much strict accountability to our commitments. And so we deliberately fail or slow down in coordination, consultation, mobilizing the resources, let time run out, and then we justify that we need more time to realize this. So that thinking, I think, in my view, perpetuating continuity for personal, probably idea or agenda could be one of the reasons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian, Samia, Madam Dr. Florence.
Thank you very much. I am reprimanded, I should say that, before everybody. I've considered myself as an advocate, but here what has been unpacked indicates that I have not done what I should have done, and I hope that from here henceforth, maybe take a radical shift in terms of how I approach development and my place where I'm supposed to serve. What I hear from the commissioners is that, or what I sense is that you are placing a lot of power in the commission itself, but I want to look at whom you are standing for, which is the civic society, the society that hardly knows how many policies are there that are directing our livestock, our cropping systems, our water issues. Yesterday, I raised an issue about water with South Africa because when it was time to vote, one, the instrument that is used for actually voting on that gazetted bill, the email, the internet system where most of the farmers hardly know that they are not on the email system, so they did not vote. Those who were against the bill voted. But the constituents that the commission and everybody else is standing for, we talked, they don't know what it is, they know that they need water, but go and do it, they cannot do it. So what are we doing about education of that civic society that we are standing for? We are putting a lot of power now in the NPC, and yet that society that needs to be part of the ones that respond to policies, to gazetted instruments, cannot respond to it. They do not, they'll hear, but they will not respond because the instruments, the mechanisms, the language, the whole fraternity that controls it is fragmented, is not clear. So that's my contribution. Thank you very much. But I will do what I need to do. I am reprimanded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Florence. I think what we'll do, we'll start with Prof. Kandawile, coming down the line to Andrew, and then Professor Zondi, and try to pick some of the questions were specific to you, but pick anything that you can. Colleagues will also pick the others, and then we round up cognizant of the closing session that is coming.
Let me start off by saying that I think politicians, as we've learned, I mean, are a very complex set of human beings. I mean, their interest is to perpetuate their stay in power. If they can manage to stay to become life presidents, they'll be more than happy to continue in staying in power. So in terms of messaging, therefore, it is important that, you know, particularly in terms of ensuring that they respond to the priorities that have been defined, whether within the context of national planning commissions or whether it's in terms of certain policy interventions. It's absolutely critical, therefore, that, you know, the messaging is not just from one entity, even the National Planning Commission alone, again, in response to Dr. Flores there, cannot come from one entity. It's got to be a collective voice. It's got to be a collective voice of, you know, these coalitions, these stakeholders. So it's not just the voice of, you know, the leadership of the commission, but it's got to be the leadership of the collectivity, particularly civil society organizations. But even those civil society organizations must speak to, you know, messages that are, you know, align with even some of the political goals as well as developmental goals. That's why the question of ensuring that we address some of these political economy issues, you know, how do we reconcile those? I mean, those which speak to economic goals as well as transformative goals. I mean, how do you align those? You know, this is where researchers come in, thought leadership, new knowledge comes in. So if we can, I mean, this is why some of us have been emphasizing on looking at, you know, some few successful interventions that are indisputable, that they're successes. You dangle those in their front. They want to be popular. They want to be populist. You know, why not send messages that are, you know, these interventions are working, and you know, they'll make you famous. Please, you know, let's put more money there. You know, so there are ways of actually engaging them. But what they don't want is one voice that is seen to be threatening. They'll silence you. They've got the whole state machinery at their disposal. You'll be gone, you know. But bring in other voices, but also in the process seek allies beyond even civil society organizations. Even within the political space itself, there are other allies that are, you know, you can identify who are closer to the leadership, and how do you bring them? So it's about doing our homework, even as, you know, policy institutions, as you know, planning commissions, and say, you know, who are the allies? How do we bring them on board to make sure that they exert pressure on the leadership?
Thank you very much. I will try to pick a few that I managed to capture. And I think some of the, you know, responses or maybe reactions are kind of learning points for national planning entities or planning commissions, so to speak. In Malawi, I would give an example that one of the key enablers to our vision is called mindset change. So the mindset change enabler is trying to really give some kind of reflection across all the development space, starting with the planning, even the technocrats themselves, because we could be used to a certain way of doing things and have created a tradition out of that, which has not worked to our advantage as planning agencies. So there's this mindset change program that's going around across the development space, targeting policymakers, politicians, even civil society organizations, on how we can identify things that are actually originating from the mind and they are slowing down or stopping advancement of development in the context that we're working with. So that's some of the technical programs that have actually been put in place. And in Malawi, civil society organizations have actually received this with a lot of excitement, and they're running with it. The key issue is how much traction are we making on it, and I think that's something that we need to reflect on. The issue about maybe speaking to dead, you use the certain phrase, Beatrice, to say, how are we really pushing through an agenda that also makes us to reflect on our own capacities to have resources to finance our development? You have used natural resources or natural endowments that we have. And that's why maybe for Malawi we have the enabler of environmental sustainability. The reason why we have to use our environmental resources in a sustainable fashion is because we've looked at them as potential resources to fund our own development undertakings. And the idea now is to make sure that we value our own resources and quantify. In demography, we do what we call resource accounting, particularly using the concept of carrying capacity to say how much can this particular set of natural resources and capacities support the livelihoods of this much population at that point in time. So the issue is that we also have to undertake an environmental resource accounting so that we can actually plunge that into our economic analysis to facilitate appropriate allocation of such kind of resources to development initiatives. Francis talked about the issue about national planning offices leveraging on the knowledge within the region, facilitating uptake of research by policymakers and the like. Yes, I'd like to really give you some comfort on that. We have what we call national planning entities that has been established in the wake of the need to ensure that we share insights within the region about how much policy driven kind of interventions should be facilitated along those lines. But the key issue is that we haven't been active and aggressive in operationalizing those kind of entities. They are actually to build research, enhance knowledge uptake, innovations and technologies, and facilitating such kind of dialogue with policymakers in the space. The issue about civil society role, I think Prof has really expounded it more. Development is not a government business only. It's everyone. So what we've noted is that perhaps maybe our civil society organizations have actually been so much aggressive on the negative part of it, to what maybe Prof referred, that when you speak more a lot of things that are not happening right, and you don't offer appropriate solutions to that, it definitely will give some backfiring signals on whatever initiatives could be there. And what we've done, like in the context of Malawi, is to strengthen our civil society network by working with non-government organization bodies to facilitate information flow from government, and then they take it to the society, and even give us feedback from the society on how the local population is actually interpreting whatever we are doing, and making sure that we're also making it possible for the people out there to access progress on how we are moving with every kind of development intervention. I think I'll stop there for the time being on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Zondi, anything that's not in the post?
Thank you very much. I must just say, just maybe 2 points. The first point is we are all trained how to manage things from the very first year of school all the way to university and further. We are trained how to manage things. As a result, we are masters of things, and we can really do that. That is why we plan so well. That's why we write so well. That is why we can do all the reviews so well. We are trained to manage things. But we are not trained to manage two other factors that are important. One, to manage ourselves. Secondly, to manage people. And because in the end, we find that the biggest challenge is people. You know, I saw a study that showed that in 1957, Ghana and South Korea were at exactly the same stage of development. But in 8 years, they had pulled apart. Ghana had stayed the same or regressed, and South Korea has accelerated forward. And then you wonder, what was the biggest differentiating factor? Studies showed that, by the way, Ghana had more resources than South Korea. Actually, Ghana had more capacity than South Korea. It continues to have a lot of capacity. But what the biggest differentiator was, the South Koreans were very confident, and they were also confident in themselves and their own. It doesn't sound like scientific, isn't it? The biggest differentiator between those who developed and those who did not develop is the level of confidence they have in themselves and the level of confidence they have in their own. South Korea will have the most successful agricultural and food system program. Do you know what it is called? It is not called Comprehensive Agricultural Program. It wouldn't have been in the African continent. It is called Samelu Dong. What is Samelu Dong? It's the cultural practice of Koreans going centuries back that they revived in order to drive their agriculture. With us, we go outside to borrow a scientific concept and not look into indigenous concept because we have no confidence in our own. If something is in English, it sounds like it's more advanced. But if it is in Bemba, it sounds like it's backward. It's a big problem. Now, if you say, Madam, what are we doing to raise awareness of people and all that? How do people who themselves are not aware raise awareness of the others who are not aware? You ask people who are not aware to make the people who are not aware that they are also not aware. So we do need to change the education system. The education system, must build confidence in ourselves.
True.
Even if we don't get to do technology well, even if we don't get to master chemistry well, if we can do self better, we will succeed a lot better because that is the capacity we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those parting words have left us with food for thought, including food to eat in the next hour. But food for thought is way forward. I leave that to the Secretariat. Kanto, come and tell us the next and dismiss us. But before we do that, I think there's a photo shot. Can we just give one round of applause to thank our commissioners, our distinguished speakers and panelists. While the photographers are getting ready in Kanto, you can also join us in the photo because you were part of us. Thank you.